Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for the final Ralston College virtual open house of this series. My name is Rosa Maria, and I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions here at Ralston. I graduated from the program just last year, so it's especially meaningful for me to be now in a role where I get to help welcome our next incoming class. And we are really glad that you're here. Just to briefly set the stage for you, Ralston College is based in Savannah, Georgia, and we offer a one-year master's in the humanities centered on serious reading, shared inquiry, and the renewal of humanistic study. The program is taught in 2 locations, which is a big part of the experience. First, we start in Greece, where students focus on ancient and modern Greek, and then here in Savannah, where we read some of the most influential works of the Western canon, beginning in antiquity, and then moving through the medieval and into modern times. So as you're getting a sense of the program, it's also helpful that you know that we're currently in the middle of our admissions cycle with our priority deadline coming up on December 18th. So that is one of the reasons that we're especially glad that you could join us today. And I'll also mention that full funding opportunities are available for qualified applicants. And all of this connects directly to why we host these virtual open houses. They're meant to give you a real feel of what it's like to be in a Ralston classroom, how we read together, how we think, and also how we work through the big questions and we grapple with them together. And today's session is going to be a great example of that. And with that, I have the great pleasure of introducing to you a man who I had the privilege to study under, Professor Daniel Gallagher. Professor Gallagher teaches philosophy and literature here at Ralston, and before joining, he held positions at Cornell University, the University of Notre Dame, Aquinas College, and St. Mary's College, and he also spent a decade serving as the secretarial staffs of Pope Benedict and Francis. And he specializes in medieval philosophy and is the author of numerous articles in metaphysics and aesthetics and theology. And it is going to be a real treat for you to get to hear from him today. He is going to be discussing Homer's Iliad, and we are very grateful to have him with us today. So with that, I'll turn that over to you, Professor Gallagher.
Thank you, Rosa Maria, and welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you this morning and to discuss with you a particular aspect of Homer's Iliad, a broad theme, but one nonetheless very important, and that is politics. So this is to give you a taste of how we proceed here at Ralston and how we address these great works that we read together. And I do presume that many, if not most of you, are at least familiar with Homer's Iliad. And if you are not, do not worry, because it's not necessary for this lecture, although it certainly will help. But after I give a short presentation, when it is time to ask questions, please do not be embarrassed if you are not that familiar with Homer's Iliad, because again, I'm trying to give some of the broad sub-themes under the theme of politics that emerge in Homer's Iliad. And I decided to approach this because I think at least some of you have been at prior lectures of this type before. This is the last in the series, that I am going to at least allude and, in fact, address somewhat explicitly some of the works that have already been discussed. And so chronologically, it's sort of working backwards, but thematically, it shouldn't be a problem at all. So with that, let me share my screen. So again, let's talk about politics and Homer's Iliad. Now, I didn't use the title Politics in Homer's Iliad, which would have worked just fine, but I would like to think about the broader issues that emerge in Homer's Iliad that give both us and have given history and great thinkers an opportunity to reflect on what it means to live in community. So if you need an initial definition of politics, we are going to be that broad, how to live together. But as we go through very quickly a sort of history of the early thinking in the ancient world on politics, we'll see that there are themes that we would associate with politics today, but that politics itself doesn't mean showing up at the election polls or who happens to be president and so on. Both politics in the sense of how we think about it, I would hope, but certainly without doubt in the ancient world is much broader than that. So if we think about the way that both Homer and Virgil represent the world to us, represent nature to us in its broadest sense. We have undoubtedly a focus on an aspect of human nature that is twofold. Namely, we're selfish beings. We're looking out for our own good, our own aggrandizement, our own political and social ascension, and so on. And yet, we live with others. And if you look at this picture here, all I want to show is that there was a very intimate connection between how the Romans thought about this, and more specifically, for those of you who were there for Dr. Butterfield's presentation, the Aeneid, and the way that Homer was thinking about this in the Iliad. So just as a picture here, you can see in the background, you can see ruins of Rome. You can see what looks to be the facade, in fact, of the rising St. Peter's, based basically with a sort of gelling with the Colosseum. And then you also see the temple, the Palace of Domitian there and the Palatine Hill, kind of on the right. You see other Roman figures in the background. The Romans thought of themselves basically as inheritors, not only inheritors of the Greek tradition, but those who were trying to perfect it. And one of the ways they were trying to do this, if not the way that they were trying to do this, was through politics. And so that's something just to keep in mind, the importance of this theme. Here's another picture to show this. We have Hector and Andromache. And Astyanax you see there as well, in Andromache's arms. You might know this famous scene from the Iliad. But again, the only point that I want to make is, look at this. We have a scene from the Iliad set clearly in St. Peter's Square, with the colonnade in the background and Castel Sant'Angelo there. Sort of a shadow of the obelisk to the left, perhaps. But again, think of the way that the artist has put these two time periods together precisely as a way of showing that Homer is the background for everything that Rome achieved, at least in the artist's mind, and not only in the artist's mind, but certainly in the Roman's mind. Now, this, of course, is not the Iliad, but the Aeneid. But this first line here, arma varumque cano, I sing of arms and the man. And we have a statue there showing Aeneas escaping Troy with his father and his son. A very famous literary scene, but also often depicted in art. Virgil, the only point I want to make here is that, in fact, Virgil, if we were to summarize the entire plot, in a way, is reversing the entire fall of Troy. So again, by connecting with that Homeric epic of the Iliad and connecting with that epic of the Odyssey, Virgil tries to construct in a literary way the very basis of a political empire, the greatest that part of the world had ever seen. And so again, this is very conscious, and it involves literature, that in fact Virgil would be drawing on the great poet Homer. And so at Ralston here, one thing to keep in mind is that by imitating the ancients, so to speak, we can't think of a better way of starting to explore these themes than in the way that they did in the ancient world, namely through literature and through these great epic poems. Now, these are themes: wrath, which we have in the Iliad, the first word, timē. We have a man in the Odyssey, arms and a man. This is put together by Aeneid, in the Aeneid, by Virgil in the Aeneid. And as far as the politics that emerge in the Aeneid, we have, in fact, the conflict that comes with being a single individual and trying to stake out territory and to claim to a political community. And this is, again, the very dilemma that strikes us in the Iliad as well. Now, there are several ways in which we can think of, again, the Aeneid, but in order to, if you have read the Aeneid and you haven't read the Iliad, you already have a blueprint of how to think about a structure for the Iliad, and you might not know it. Likewise, in reverse, if you have read the Iliad but not the Aeneid, you have the rudiments of how the Aeneid is constructed. And the broadest way we can think about this is to think about, we have the story of the fall of a civilization in Troy, and the concentration of this is on the present moment. In other words, if you have read the Iliad, you know that we are in the last year of the war, indeed probably the last weeks. And we have this conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles. And it all revolves around Achilles' wrath of the dishonor that he has been shown by Agamemnon, and Achilles' decisions based on that wrath, the most significant of which was to withdraw from battle. And this had a major effect on the way that the battle ensues. And then we have this, so to speak, reversed in the Aeneid, where we have the rise of a civilization. And so Rome is that civilization that arises, which is replacing Troy. And if we can only just even barely imagine the expanse of Troy and the power that it held, which is really quite extraordinary, both in the imagination of the poet, but also most likely in history, we would have some idea of how grand Rome thought of itself, to think of itself as the new Troy. Now, one of the things we also do at Ralston here, and again, I know that just a few of you at least were perhaps at Dr. Bryson's lecture, is explore the development of this theme, and we're talking particularly about the theme of politics here, when it comes from moving from work to work. And so again, we're working backwards. So if you look at the right part of your screen, I have Virgil in the Aeneid here. And then we'll work back to Aeschylus for a moment, and then look at Homer. What contextualizes the writing and the reading of the Aeneid? Political threats from within, civil war. Rome has emerged from a great civil war. All civilizations have experienced this kind of conflict, right? No matter how hard you try to establish some kind of republic or some kind of a political state, that sooner or later there will be internal threats to that. And if you think about the republic of the republic, we have, in fact, our own republic, that is the United States of America, we've had this conflict ourselves. Now, another way of thinking about these different conceptions of what we have in Virgil and Aeschylus and Homer is this way. And now let's start at the left. And this is something that I borrow from Martin Heidegger. Those of you who may have had some course on metaphysics or the philosophy of nature or both probably have some conception of what we're talking about with these terms. And you don't need to know Greek to actually grasp them. But in Homer and in the Iliad, what we're talking about when we talk about basically the political sub-theme, we're talking about nature or being as physis, the very root we have for physical or physics. And this physis, which is often translated as nature, but could also be translated, as Martin Heidegger explains, as being, is a welling up. In other words, being wells up from within and strives for some kind of a fulfillment through change, through development. And of course, this has been explored by Plato and Aristotle and all the great philosophers. But we're thinking of it now in the broadest sense, that being or nature, as we have it in Homer, and the conflicts that arise with Achilles and other characters in Homer, is that of a welling up. And we'll talk about that more specifically when it comes to wrath in a moment. In Aeschylus, which perhaps some of you have read, and I would hope that some of you would consider coming to Ralston to read, because we spend time with the Oresteia, which is the classic perhaps, Greek tragedy. And in Aeschylus, again, as identified by Heidegger, he brings forth being as a poiēsis, a bringing forth, a putting down, a laying the foundations of. And of course, this is the root that we have for poetics. And that poetics takes place both in a literary way in something like the Greek tragedy that Aeschylus writes of the Oresteia, this trilogy that is so famous. Poiēsis as being is also broader than that. It's bringing forth something within. You can almost think of it as more refined, whereas physis doesn't seem to have anything that it is trying to realize itself in. It just continues to well up in an almost unbridled way when it comes to Achilles' wrath. With what happens in the Oresteia and that familial drama that takes place, again, you don't need to know necessarily the details or even the characters of right now. If you do, you'll know well what I'm talking about, that it is an attempt to end the conflict, the familial bloodshed. And this takes a bringing forth. What's brought forth? Some kind of a system of justice. Now in Virgil, interestingly, when it comes to being or nature, the primary lens through which we understand being is technē, where we get technological or technology. This is the imposition of a form. Now, what is meant by this? In the political arena, this would mean that Rome prided itself on being able to come up with a body of law and impose it on other peoples. And this led to the expansion of an empire. And this is what we understand as this technē, or the imposing of a form in a place where it did not exist before. You can think of this in other ways when it comes to technology, but in the political sense, this also has great utility as a concept because, again, it's not the welling up of that unbridled being or nature within our soul. It's not the poiēsis, or the bringing forth of something that's there, but it is the establishment of something that is not there. And that's what technē is all about. Finally, in this transposition of Homer, we can see that takes place in Virgil. We see that whereas Homer talks about the tale of the Iliad and the wrath of Achilles, and the final reconciliation of that wrath in the final scene, as you know, with King Priam, and then moves to the Odyssey as the next part in this epic, and the travels of Ulysses or Odysseus back to Ithaca. But in the Aeneid, we have the Odyssean part first. We have the journey of Aeneas moving westward to establish his new home, a new political community. And then the Iliadic part, because it ends in conflict and war. And I'm sure the ending of this, for those of you who are there, has already been discussed, or you're familiar with it, in the very baffling and somewhat troubling ending of Aeneas killing Turnus at the end of the Aeneid. Now, let's get to some specific questions that emerge in the reading of both the Iliad, but also in the Aeneid. When it comes to politics, should one merge with another community? Now, perhaps this is more evident in the Aeneid because towards the end of it, this is a distinct possibility that is discussed, that perhaps the Rutilians and the Trojan refugees can come together to form one community. Now, of course, if you're familiar with the Aeneid, you know that we already encountered this, culminating in Book 6 with the death of Dido. But along that way, to the ends to that tragic suicide, this whole question of merging with another community, of the community of Carthage with the Trojan refugees under the direction of Aeneas, that there is a possibility of merging there as well. So again, that is a large question that underpins the entire reading of the Iliad and the Aeneid. Should one stake out a new community? When do we do this? All right, you can think of this as a perennial question. When did the founding fathers, let's say, of this republic, the United States, when did they decide, okay, well, it's not going to work to be in some ways connected with the old community, let's stake out a new community? When should one conquer, if ever, another community? This is something that we see that is happening both in the Iliad and in the Aeneid. And this is a political question as well. Now, one of the important, perhaps in some ways, the most important thing that emerges when it comes to the Iliad is, how do the gods fit into answering these questions? Now, what do I mean by the gods? All I mean here, I do mean the gods directly that we encounter in the Iliad, because they're so interesting and we meet so many of them. But I want to think more broadly, to think of those gods as being forces beyond our control, forces beyond our direct action. And we can think of, however we think, we don't need a religion or anything in particular, think of the gods in this way today. So catastrophes, be they natural, be they man-made, right? How do these fit into the answers of those questions, those political questions that I just brought forth? And this is particularly evident, I think, as well in the Iliad. I'm going to just mention these things here because this is so interesting. This is a painting by Ingres. So you see the date there. You can think of if you know any history, French history, you know where we are pretty much in this tale here. So Napoleonic era, and the attempt to establish a new republic, and all of the ideals associated with that. That's when this painting was executed. And this is just to give you an idea of how large it is. And it indeed is based on something even larger, because this was one of the wonders of the world, the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which has been lost, but is described to us by the ancient authors. And this is an artist's imaginative reproduction of this. But think of this as representative, so to speak, of, by the way, of course, this is that episode I should have mentioned, of course, because this is where the question of the gods' role in answering those political questions really begins to come to the fore in the Iliad, right? So we have Thetis entreating Zeus to turn the tides upon the Greeks, because that's the way Achilles wants it, that he has been offended, his honor has been attacked, as he sees it, and he asks his mother, Thetis, to entreat Zeus to now turn the war against the allies, that is Agamemnon and all the allies, as a sign that Achilles has been offended. In any case, look at how this has been appropriated, both from the ancient world, right, through Homer, and into early 19th century France. Okay, a couple of basic Greek terms. You don't need to know Greek to get these, but I think that they're very important for understanding how politics emerges in the Iliad. When Agamemnon, this is how, of course, you know, if you're familiar with the work, you know how it begins. He insists on taking Briseis. He takes away the timē, the honor, away from Achilles, and secures it for himself. So honor, valor, status, lots of different ways we can translate this timē. But the idea is that this is the central value which causes a conflict, right? Now, this is not to say that this honor in any way is self-centered and individual, because we know one of the things we take too much for granted when it comes to the Iliad is for this alliance that has gone now to try to enact justice by taking Helen back as the rightful possession of the wife from the husband she's been taken. That timē is at the center of every conflict, and it has a social dimension all the way through when it comes to the Iliad. And I would suggest that this is one of the reasons why the Iliad continues to be read, has been read, and continues to be read, for us to think about this theme of timē, or honor, and how it basically fits into the picture of who we think of ourselves as individuals, but then more importantly, how we fit into a community. And I think that's the very essence of what's going on, especially in those opening books of the Iliad. This theme of timē is obviously fundamentally connected with the theme of grief, akos, but the cosmic wrath or anger of Achilles, meanness. So all these themes are connected. But when it comes to politics, this honor, when it comes to the Iliad, is the first thing that really emerges for us. Okay. Now, let's just think of, we have a few minutes left here before I want to open up the discussions. Because, of course, I would imagine in the hearts and minds of many of you, and of course in most of the world, always asking, why do we read these old works? Everything's changed so much. Well, probably, at least in some dimensions of life, much less than we would think. So the basic loci of politics we find in the Iliad are the same we would find today, right? In other words, family. We can think, I'm not limiting it to the characters of Hector and Andromache, but if we think of those two characters, that's a perfect example of the way in which a sub-theme that emerges that has a basic political dimension is family. Friendship, okay, at all levels. Patroclus and Achilles being a central example, and yet we have all kinds of other examples as well. And then the most challenging one, the polis, right? Which, strictly speaking, of course, we could argue is not existent in that classical sense in the time period that Homer is writing about with the end of the Trojan War. Okay. That's a very complicated thing that we won't address right now. We can talk about it when we discuss in a couple of minutes. But this is the most challenging one. And this is the one that I want to suggest is emerging in that physis way and that basic nature way in the Iliad. That we don't have, even by the end of the epic, a very clear answer to that question. Now, very quickly, this is a theme, obviously, polis, that is explored by Plato and then systematized by Aristotle. In fact, giving emergence to both a work of his, one of his most famous works, and something that we still talk about today when we put this into a substantive noun way. Ta politica, the political things. Now, famously, Aristotle studied no fewer than 158 polises, so to speak, city-states, and tried to figure out in almost a scientific way of what was common to them. And so we see this frenetic activity based on their knowledge of Homer and the Iliad as a poem that drives figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to come up with some answers to the key questions of politics that I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago. Aristotle saw politics as a practical science that stemmed from the study of ethics, which, as you know, if you have studied your basic broad outlines of the philosophy that emerges from Greece and from Athens, right, becomes the central concern of Socrates. And by Aristotle, in that same tradition, we have politics as a crowning jewel of what ethics is all about. That is how individuals should live. What is the good life? How should we live together? Okay. So I'd like to conclude, although we'll open up a possibility for another lecture that we'll have to leave for another day. So if this ta politica, these politics, if it does have this connection with ethics that emerges in the Iliad and in the Odyssey and in the Aeneid, what is the key idea that politics needs to work out? There we go. Okay, it's going to be justice, all right? Dikē, justice. And all I want to say here is that this seems a little bit too obvious to us today. What do I mean by that? In other words, we have, of course, a whole history of trying to work this out, and we'll continue to try to work this out, this idea and philosophy and law and so on. But I want to suggest this is that thing that emerges, which gives birth to that more systematized treating that we have in Plato and Aristotle when it comes to how to organize ourselves, okay? So just to give one final example from the Iliad, here's the ambassadors of Agamemnon come to the tent of Achilles, right? A key scene in which we think that there's a possibility perhaps here that there will be some resolution. And of course, Achilles steadfastly, obstinately refuses to enter. He doesn't take the offer that's there. And this heightens the whole to a very interesting, high degree, the issue of justice. Because by that point in the epic, in the Iliad, we have to ask ourselves, okay, now, are we beyond that point, right? Where people, the characters, especially Achilles at this point, really is reasonable when it comes to what is just and right. And that's the eternal question that we continue to struggle with today. And we do so, I would like to suggest, as a community, much more importantly, as a community, and always will as a community, more than isolated individuals. So thank you for your attention. I'll let Rosa Maria kind of open up now for some questions and discussion. I see there's already one in the question and answer box there. I'd be happy to start with that one. The armor that falls from Patroclus, the armor of Achilles, is allowed by Zeus to be given to Hector, since death was hovering near him too. How can this image be a symbol for Homer's intention to describe image, the Greek tragic sensibility of fate? That which is glorious almost seems cursed, speaking to a deep longing in the Iliad to escape the world of entropy and death. How can this idea be a seabed that Greek literature goes through and beyond? in Romans Virgil, eventually being fully realized in Dante and the beatific vision. Okay. How does this process relate to Aristotle's theory of catharsis? Could you briefly describe this transformation? Wonderful question, Daniel. Thank you for asking. Very broad. I mean, not broad at all, but very involved. And a very, in fact, not broad, but pointed question, but with many different aspects. Let me briefly describe this transformation by saying that precisely, I think, what the Iliad introduces for us is let's say, unfulfilled proposition of, in fact, the way that fate is either on anybody's side, be it the gods or human beings. Okay, and fate, as you've suggested here, the fata, continue to be a central theme in Virgil's Aeneid, where we wonder there too if there is any resolution to this question. Now, I believe that there are some new elements of a resolution that come forward in Virgil, but I'm going to skip over those for now. But just to mention that a key moment in this transformation that Daniel is getting at here does take place in Aeschylus, in the Oresteia, in an interesting way, because there we have the Furies transform into the Humanities, and there is a very close relationship to fate with this. And what this means is that fate doesn't disappear, but in a way is channeled and transformed, at least in the minds of Aeschylus and in the Greeks, as a way of presenting itself, let's say, or themselves, the fata, the three fates, if we take the mythological depiction of them, and then beyond into Virgil's mind of the fata, the plural of the fates, that this transformation takes place because of a channeling of what they bring about. Now, that's a fancy way to say something, to say more plainly that human communities are trying to figure out how they can take unpredictable things that happen into their advantage, into their side, and to not necessarily to control them, but to accept them and to, so to speak, piggyback on them in order to establish communities. Great question. Let's go on here. Okay. We have one from Ivan here. Oh, salve. Yes, good. I see Ivan. Good to see your name there. And been a while. All right. Is the Augustan rise of civilization in Virgil's Aeneid imaginable without the total destruction of Troy? And how does this narrative of necessary collapse function as a model of political legitimacy that continues to inform modern discourses of civilization of decline and renewal? Very good question, Ivan. Big question. I don't have, to be quite honest, a really satisfactory answer to these modern discourses of civilizational decline and renewal. When I say satisfactory, I mean satisfactory to myself, let alone to others. And what I mean by that is I find that by reading these works, and let's just take the Iliad and the Aeneid as examples here, and let's say the destruction of Troy being, of course, not present in the Iliad, but what the Iliad is kind of heading for, and then being fulfilled in the Aeneid. I don't take this to be necessary for myself a lesson in inevitable cyclical nature of the rise and fall of civilizations, but rather a lesson in the factors that would lead to the fall of a civilization and the things that are needed to build a civilization. So I suppose, personally, I don't have myself a very coherent meta-narrative that kind of goes beyond the ideas of, let's say, human agency, if that makes sense. But I find precisely human agency being the thing that gives us, that the exploration of human agency, which is the thing that fascinates me and gives me the most compelling conclusions that emerge from the Iliad and the Aeneid. Okay. Good. Wrath can't get the last word. Yes, I see that. Very good. I agree with that. I agree with that. And this is from James. And in fact, of course, wrath does not in the Iliad, but this is a very good observation, because one of the things that we explore here at Ralston, at least I explore with my students when we move then beyond the Iliad, is, okay, so it doesn't get the last word, but are we comfortable with that resolution? And is it going to work every time? When I mean every time, the kind of reconciliation that we seem to get between Achilles and Priam, how can that be replicated, if at all? Any other questions?
I actually do have one for you, Professor Gallagher. So I know that you've mentioned to me that your life's work really is circling around this one question of being. And I was wondering what sort of insight the Iliad gave you into this big question that's driving your work.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Rosemary. Good question. So, as a reader of the Iliad and as someone who discusses this work with, of course, as I did with you and with other students, especially here at Ralston, um, with my interest in metaphysics and the meaning of being, what I find in the Iliad most interesting, it's related to Heidegger's observation of this welling up. In other words, that in the midst of all the change that is both within, let's say, outside of our control, so we would think of the physical world and how the world changes around us, and then how the world changes within human agency, what are we looking for ultimately to give that structure? So physis as a concept, of course, when we have physics and Newtonian physics, right, we retain that idea of change. So the world is constantly changing. Of course, we can go back to Heraclitus and Parmenides. I'm sure many in our audience might be familiar with attempts to answer this whole question of how to understand change. But for me, in the Iliad, this idea of change is now explored in an unprecedented way, in a way which perhaps has barely been paralleled or surpassed in the human realm. So when Achilles has this change, right, and he has a couple of changes, but that initial change of wrath, right, it only gets worse and worse. What is it both within him and around him that makes it possible for that wrath to not only be curbed, but channeled? And that's the most important kind of like question for me that emerges in the Iliad. And there are lots of different ways to approach it, address it, and answer it. And I think that like any good work of literature, when we reread the Iliad, it gives us one more opportunity to take our own experience to the work and see how to answer it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I see that Ethan here also had a question, perhaps.
Yeah, in the context of the technological nature of the modern good, I'll do in the context of the technological nature of the modern age, how do these works inform how technē should fit into the political space? Okay, Ethan, thank you. Very good question. Um, so if we talk about let's limit these works. If you mean that by, let's say, Homer and Virgil, now, because there are other works as well. Well, of course, all the works we read here, but let me start with those works. Let's see. Technē. I think that what these works teach us is this: that technē seems to be of the three. So if we think of physis, poiēsis, and technē, that which we are most in control of, right? To the point, and there are struggles of this, particularly in modernity, strictly speaking, right? As something that, or the modern project of modernity, it's that now. When I say now, I mean in the modern period. Perhaps technē can simply surpass the insights that we gained through both physis and poiēsis. I think these works teach us, and even the Iliad teach us otherwise. In other words, that there are ways in which technology, and it can be that in the widest sense of, making weapons, to building political communities, to getting as far as we can in designing AI models, right? That physis and poiēsis, so to speak, never go away. So in other words, that we still always have this welling up And we still, in many areas of life, not just the fine arts, we will always have this desire for poiēsis, for putting forth. And what I mean by that is discovering something and cherishing it and not altering it and putting it forth. And I think that's what poiēsis basically is. That's how I think these works help us to understand the limits of technē. Now, into the political space, there too, I would simply put, Ethan, to put it very simply, we can't expect too much of politics. Okay, you can disagree with me, but I'm expressing when I look at the history and I read the political works, there's a great temptation that it will solve everything. Well, I think if there's space for physis and poiēsis, that alone should teach us that it won't solve everything. Technē won't solve everything. Okay, great. I see Tyler has a question. How do stories like Prometheus and other myths gods tie into technē regarding the dangers of technology when the gods give man what he is not ready for? Tyler, very good. And that question dovetails on, I think, what I was suggesting as an answer to Ethan's question. The Prometheus is a wonderful example in the stealing of fire, right? Let me just expand briefly on this. That what I see in these stories and these myths, again, so I'm going to phrase what I just said now in a different way. There are two approaches we can take to the world that we find around us in the cosmos, right? Nature. There's not only a sense of, let's say, dominance. So in other words, to overcome what seem to be limitations in the natural world around us. That could be making automobiles. That could be using fire, right? Controlling fire to extract from the Promethean myth, right? And so on. So using, okay? There's also the question of understanding, right? What I mean is that science tries to understand the world around us, and even the political realm, if we consider that to be a kind of science, right? To understand what's there without any major concern for technē or changing it at all. But then there's one more element that I think these stories tell us, and Prometheus is a good example of this, and this is honor or respect. And that comes both towards individuals, but towards the world around us. Awe, wonder, respect, regard. And another word I would add to this is integrity, right? Then when we look at the Iliad, for example, that there are slight hints that the integrity, the integral resolution that's sought is not simply between warring parties and individuals, but with the world at large, okay? And other myths like Prometheus bring this out. All right, I see if we have time, I'm not in any rush, but I see another one came up for here. So let me just briefly read this and then, good. Is there significance to the way the Iliad starts and the Aeneid in medias res? Okay, so in, don't mean to correct the Latin there, but that's a common thing I see there. It's in medias res. Does that comment on a view of metaphysics? Okay, good question. So Iliad starts, right? And the Aeneid starts in the middle of the action. So it starts in a wonderful way. It's a literary thing, but I like this question because I think it's a wonderful way to, this is actually one of the best examples, I think, of showing that we're dealing with anything more than just a literary device, although it is a literary device. So for those of you, most of you might be familiar, in medias res, for example, let's take the Aeneid, right? That after a brief introduction and invocation of the gods, what Virgil does is plunge us into the action of Aeneas in a storm at sea, right? And then more importantly, contextualizes this within the wrath of Juno, right? Who asks the god of the winds to stir up the winds, and then Neptune gets mad and squelches them, and so on. And then we move into the past because Aeneas tells Dido the whole story of how they got there in the first place. And then we move into the future when he goes to the underworld. In medias res, this isn't the kind of story that you tell chronologically, beginning, middle, and end. Now, the Iliad is more like that. But again, the Iliad doesn't tell us, I'm sorry, an extensive background, but I just love this theme. The Iliad, of course, just presumes that the reader knows about the judgment of Paris, knows about the sacrifice of Iphigenia, knows about some of the background story of Achilles and so on, and just throws us into this story. Okay, now, the question is, does this comment in a view of metaphysics? Well, I haven't thought about this extensively, but I'll just offer one answer. I think that the question, if we take metaphysics to be the study of being as being, I think we can also approach that in medias res from several different angles. Now, it's not to deny that there is methodology when we have a proper science of metaphysics or a study of being as being. I think there is, and there might be plural, but several ways in which we can approach this in a systematic way as a science. But the raising of the question of being can be done. Heraclitus is the best example of this, I think, if you've ever read his fragments. It can be done in an observational way, in an introspective way, in several different ways. And that way, I think there might be a connection between something like the way the Iliad and Aeneid starts and the study of metaphysics. Very interesting question. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that we're at time now. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with all of us, Professor Gallagher. We really appreciate it. And thank you all as well for joining.